All right, before we get started, a couple things. First of all, I'm going to be talking a decent bit about layoffs. For me, this is actually a really hard topic to talk about, so if that is something that might be hard for you to hear about, being laid off from a job, just want to let you know that's a big example I draw on throughout this talk. On a more fun note, I'm going to answer the most frequently asked question that I get in this talk. Yes, these are my dogs. They're my corgis. This one is Catherine, because she needed a royal princess name. This one's Pippin, because corgis are the hobbits of the dog world, and all of the pictures, most of the photos in this deck are pictures of my dogs. So they get a lot of credit actually for helping me maintain my mental health, so I like to put them in these talks as well. So we all know 2020 was a hot mess. And for me, 2018 was almost as bad because that was the year that my life as I knew it fell apart. That year had started out so promising. I had a brand new job I was super excited about. I had been accepted to give my second international keynote at DevTalks Romania. I was happily married at the time, a dog, a cat. I was running half marathons, hosting parties to watch soccer, football for you all matches, like just having, basically when you graduate college and you want to start building your life, in my early 30s, mid 30s, that's where I was. I was like, this is the life I've been trying to build. This is what I wanted. Then my ex-husband told me that he rented an apartment behind my back. I found this out shortly after I had fractured my ribs. And over the next few months, I would be rear-ended by a car. I had had to put my first corgi down to sleep. And I was laid off from a job, and I was laid off from that job while I was in California at a Ruby conference, and the next day I was due to be in Michigan for a .NET conference. So my entire life basically fell apart. It sounds like a bad country song, and at the time it was extremely difficult. Now it's a part of my story. Now, prior to losing that job, I had been struggling with it, basically because there was a mismatch between what I was hired to do and what the company wanted me to do. That was a failure on their part, but it taught me some lessons that have helped me, come through these hard times. So, like I said, kind of tired of sharing all those bad, tragic things that happened in my life, but I can't share lessons learned about failure without that. So, at this point, I'm living alone by myself for the first time as an adult. I no longer had a husband who I'd been married to for 15 years. I was like learning how to live by myself, maintain a house by myself, get through all of the injuries and things, and I knew I would need support in order to survive that year. And I knew that the only way for me to find the support I needed was to put myself out there and be vulnerable. So I would open up to my friends about what I was going through, and it helped. And I pride myself on being this strong, independent person, but even the strongest people, we need help sometimes. So when that all happened, I felt like I was failing. I was failing at life because the dog, the husband, all the things you're supposed to have, gone, just gone. But the thing is that everybody fails. And we usually hear a lot of emphasis about how awesome everybody feels after you overcome failure. I always think about when you watch the Olympics and they'll tell the story of a skier who maybe breaks their leg, and then the skier goes on to win the gold medal. But they don't talk about what happens between broken leg and gold medal. They don't talk about how to get through the hard times day to day. So back to answer your question, yeah, we're going to talk about getting through hard times, and we're going to borrow some concepts from Agile to do it. First, talk a little bit more. What is vulnerability? Vulnerability is the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked, either physically or emotionally. The important thing to know about vulnerability is that it's the possibility of being attacked. It doesn't mean that you're actually going to be harmed, and in my experience, I've actually benefited far more from being vulnerable than I have been harmed by it. Vulnerability is not the same thing as weakness. Weakness is a lack of strength, it's a disadvantage, it's a fault. I need to wear contacts to see any better. That's a weakness. I, maybe can't lift 100 pounds of something. That's a weakness. Whether we like it or not, weaknesses exist, and they're a part of us. Vulnerability, on the other hand, is a state that we choose to enter. And I've come to think that it's a state that we should choose to enter, knowing that weaknesses might be revealed, knowing it can be awkward and uncomfortable, but also knowing that it's going to get you through the hard times. So I first learned about Scrum and Agile within weeks, if not days, of I used to be a tech recruiter, of my first tech recruiting job. And my mind was blown by the concept simply because I had never worked in an industry or on a team where it was baked into the way that we were doing things that you were going to fail and you were going to screw up and it was okay to make mistakes. My mind was blown. I'd been in school, I'd been in law school, previous jobs. You were not allowed to make mistakes. And so I get into these software roles and I'm like, oh, I can screw up and that's okay because I can iterate and learn from it. So I did learn a lot about Agile and Scrum. It wound up helping me get through hard times. It wound up helping my ADHD brain. But for purposes of this talk, it helped provide with a framework for discussing and handling failure. First, going to do a quick little Scrum 101, Agile 101. Stuff is taken from the scrum.org guide. Your Agile and Scrum might look different. That's fine. That's not the topic. It's just kind of familiarize and refresh people with core concepts. So Agile is a set of values and principles that remind us that people, not computers, create and maintain software. And it requires some courage because we have to admit that building software is complex, that it's not always going to work, and that we might fail at it. But the best thing about it is that it's focused on people. And an Agile team actually is a type of team that will help create an environment for you to be vulnerable, whether personally or professionally. An Agile team's focused on delighting clients. It's self-organizing. Iterations, changes, programs are driven by clients. You're focused on delivering value. But the stuff that matters for failure and the stuff that matters for getting through hard times is radical transparency and continuous improvement. Because you need to be transparent about the struggles that you're going through. If you're having a hard time at work, like when my ex told me he was leaving me, I told my boss because my boss needed to know if I wasn't on top of my game, that's what was going on. And then continuous improvement. When things go wrong, look at what went wrong, sit back and reflect on it. Scrum is just a lightweight framework. It helps teams and organizations address problems. Agile helps teams create products incrementally, and incrementally doing things is how we get through a failure. Other characteristics of Scrum teams, they are, of course, self-organizing. They are adaptable. So as things change, you can change, what you're doing, change the direction of the product. They're non-hierarchical, and you're focused on one objective at a time. And when you're going through a failure, you need to adapt. Life is changing. You got to get used to it. And you need to focus on one thing at a time, which is a mistake that I made trying to make a whole bunch of changes at once when I was just trying to get through a really rough time. And then Agile environments actually can open a space for us to be vulnerable. People agree to have courage, focus, commitment, respect, openness, this type of environment where you're allowed to talk about anything and you're allowed to talk about your struggles, and that's okay and it shouldn't hurt you professionally. Scrum events, we know, I'm sure about those. You have your sprints where things are broken down into, fixed time box, fixed iterations, basically. You have your sprint planning. You have your daily Scrum meeting where you kind of just update your team. Again, the pieces of Scrum that work really well for me when it comes to going through failure are actually the review and retrospective pieces. So when something goes wrong, for instance, when I got laid off for the first time, I sat and I did a start, stop, continue. What went wrong? What went right? What would I like to start doing? And I do this every time I have something go wrong in my life, and I often do it when I have things that go right in my life, is I sit and I reflect, and I think that it helps you be more effective. I think it helps you create better work, and I think it helps you better understand yourself and work on building the successful life that you're after. So what does that all have to do with failure? Well, failure there's an acronym, first attempt in learning. I actually really liked that one when I heard it. And Agile relies on honestly admitting that things aren't going to be perfect. It assumes that there's going to be failure from the beginning. It's built into the methodology, and you're going to be experimenting, and not every experiment's successful. We actually rely on the mistakes that we make. We rely on empiricism. It's almost kind of like the scientific method we all learned in school, but obviously way less rigorous. And hypotheses and goals aren't always right. And we figure that out as we go through these hard, failing times. So in the midst of a failure, such as a job loss. At this time last year, actually, I had been laid off yet again for the 5th time in 4 years. Never due to performance, always due to like mergers, acquisitions, a project being shuttered, something like that. But this time last year at Build Stuff, I was interviewing for the job that I currently have. And so I'm having this full circle moment of where I felt like I was completely failing and falling apart at life. I felt like the biggest imposter because I'm up here at the front of the room talking about how important it is to have a great personal brand and talking about all the stuff I've done at work. And in the back, I'm like screaming and crying internally because I don't know where I'm going to work. I don't know where I'm going to get an income, freaking out about all of that stuff. And layoffs are scary, and they trigger major anxiety, and they can make you wonder what's wrong with you. So having support is going to help a lot. And in order to fail safely, you need to have that freedom, flexibility, and support. Recently, my partner and I were talking to our 13-year-old daughter, 14 now, and she puts a lot of pressure on herself to try to be perfect. She feels like she has to ask permission for every little thing she does. And we were sitting with her and we were talking and we were like, you're not going to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes. And we would like to give you room to make mistakes and screw up so that as you grow and you become older, you can learn from those mistakes. So even at home, we make it a safe environment for people to be vulnerable and fail. The other thing about failing, the Agile thing, like fail and fail fast. So you want to fail quickly. The sooner you fail or the sooner you realize you're headed toward a failure, you can course correct, you can repair, you can adapt, maybe you can even avoid that failure. Failing quickly also means that that it will only affect one aspect of your life rather than your whole life. And failing quickly helps you avoid a scenario where you work on something for months or years only to find out it's wrong when delivered. So there are certain things that I'll do that I don't complete the whole thing at once because I want to see if I complete part of it. Is that going well? Okay, then I'll move and add and build onto it so I don't waste a bunch of time building something that doesn't come together. So, learned a lot of lessons from Agile on failure. I always liked the quote by Stefan Wolfers that says, Scrum is about figuring out what is worth building to improve lives while mitigating risks. When we're going through failure, we want to do the same thing. We want to figure out what pieces of our life are worth building and maintaining, and how do we mitigate the risk to ourselves, whether it's professionally, personally, financially, from a mental health standpoint. You have to kind of find that balance where you're moving forward, but you're also not taking on too much. And as much as it can and does feel like the end of the world, failure isn't usually the end of the world. So openly discussing it helps everybody learn and everybody move forward. Now, what happens if we don't allow room for failure for ourselves or our teams? You create this culture of fear. People are so afraid to make mistakes that they're afraid to touch something. They're afraid to do something. They're afraid to say something. And that can exclude team members. The team member who is afraid to ask a question because they don't understand what's happening. And so they just stay isolated off to themselves and feel excluded because everybody else seems to know what's going on and they don't. The bad thing about fear is that it hinders learning, it hinders innovation, and for better or worse, failure actually helps us learn and innovate. I've learned so many things from failing and screwing up all the time. And honestly, it's just crappy to work for somebody who expects perfection of you. So in retrospect, one of my first major failures was going to law school. I have a degree in philosophy, and I decided to go to law school, and I dropped out after a year. And at the time, I felt like the biggest disappointment to my dad. I was frustrated that I had already taken out so much money in student loans to get my law degree, and I just felt like a failure because I quit law school. But I eventually realized that doing what other people expected of me wasn't what mattered. What mattered was knowing my own priorities and my own goals. And by constantly reflecting on things, that's how you can understand and define those. So I took the time to reflect on what I wanted to do with myself, went back to school for my MBA, and that actually set me in the direction for the career I have now. My favorite classes were HR and marketing. That led me to recruiting. I got bit by the community bug, and now I do DevRel and community management. So since then, one of the lessons learned, I tell people to I give people advice to take time off between your undergraduate and further education, or take time off after a layoff if you can. Like, take time off to just think about what it is that you really, really want to do next, rather than going on autopilot and doing the thing that feels like the automatic thing to do. So you think about why you're doing something, whether it aligns with your goals and priorities, and if it does, you might fail, but then you'll learn, and then you'll eventually succeed. So, in spite of how much I embrace failure, and in spite of how much I talk about this, and sometimes I feel like I am a professional failure, it still sucks. It starts to suck less, but it's never fun to admit that you messed up, and it's never fun to admit that something went wrong. So how do you deal with that? How do you get through the hard time? And that's the bulk of what we're talking about today, is those days when you can hardly get out of bed, or the only reason you're getting out of bed is because your dogs need walked. How do you get through that slog? How do you get through it? Now, we fail at stuff every day. Sometimes we fail at little things like, I don't know, let a cup of coffee get cold on the counter, or you're 15 minutes late feeding your dogs. But failures can also be borderline catastrophic: divorce, job loss, an accident, something like that. A lot of times, though, failure falls in between those extremes. Maybe you missed a meeting, or you forgot to complete an assignment, you paid a bill a few days late. Like, things that aren't the end of the world, but they are frustrating. The thing is that failure can feel catastrophic, even when it isn't. If you've ever had one of those days where, like, everything's going wrong, and then you knock your coffee over and you just start bawling, it's not that you're upset because you spilled your coffee. You're upset because everything was going wrong, and so in that moment, that feels catastrophic, and that's completely valid. It's human, and it's normal. And other days, I might spill my coffee and just laugh about it. So that's normal. So we survive failure, again, by being vulnerable. It's what got me through hard times. It's what gets me through the pandemic. It's what gets me through life's ups and downs. But previously, being, your kind of stereotypical, like, straight A student, honor roll, all the things, whatever, all that, like, I never wanted people to see me make mistakes. Also, I'm an oldest daughter. Never wanted people to see me make mistakes. Never wanted people to hear about the bad things in my life. Like, I wanted to put up this persona that everything was perfect because that's what people had known. But when big aspects or every aspect of your life is falling apart, you can't keep that up. And so I'd always been viewed as this, like, strong, badass woman in colorful clothes. And I used to think that I needed to keep that up, and I needed to keep that persona up in this industry. But it turns out I don't always have to present as the strongest woman around. I can also just be myself. So when I first started talking about this and looking into this topic, I did it as part of a talk I give on discussing mental illness and prioritizing our mental health and technology. This is my big cause in tech. And in that talk, in all these talks, I get very vulnerable about my own struggles with anxiety, ADHD, and depression. And I encouraged other people to talk about this and be vulnerable as well. I eventually realized there was some power in vulnerability. Every time I gave that mental health and tech talk, somebody would ask me if I'd read a book by Brené Brown. Has anybody read Brené Brown? Daring Greatly? Okay. So she writes this book about basically the power of vulnerability. I actually wanted to call this talk The Power of Vulnerability, and I couldn't because that's the title of her book. But she gives a talk, and so I hadn't read the book, but I eventually did read the book as part of the preparation for this talk, and I appreciated what she had to say. I, to some extent, held off reading her books because I wanted to form my own opinions without an expert influencing them. And the section where she talks about what she calls vulnerability myths, the lies we tell ourselves, why we can't be vulnerable, really stuck to me. And this quote in particular strikes me. It says, "Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. And if we want greater clarity or purpose, or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path." In general, I recommend reading Daring Greatly. I'm not a self-help book person, but this one's actually based in neuroscience, and I did find it useful, so really enjoyed it. A couple other things that I have borrowed from her are she puts these vulnerability myths in place, right? Like you said, the lies that we tell ourselves about why we can't be vulnerable. So we tell ourselves, I can't be vulnerable because then it shows that I'm weak. We tell ourselves, it's just not something I do, or it's oversharing to tell people I know professionally that my husband left. Or my favorite lie, I'm fine on my own, I got this, I can handle it. And you're strong, and you got this, and you can handle it, but you might need some help. So instead, what Brene Brown does is says, instead of like shielding and armoring ourselves against those myths, she has this concept of daring greatly, and that's basically kind of reframing these kind of negative behaviors that we can do to shield ourselves from vulnerability into other mindsets, basically. So she talks about something called foreboding joy. And foreboding joy is that kind of, well, at least this or that happened, and you're just supposed to be super grateful for it. And you're never supposed to admit that anything is wrong. But in reality, she suggests instead of saying that, go ahead and admit that things are wrong, but also maybe practice some gratitude about things that are right. To this day, the pinned tweet on my Twitter/X profile is a tweet that I put out in 2018 where I said I was grateful to my communities for getting me through some hard times. And kind of practicing gratitude and reflecting on the good things in those moments can actually be a big help. We try to shield ourselves with perfectionism rather than appreciating the beauty of cracks. And I'm all about the beauty of cracks. I love speaking on human skills. I love learning about people because I like how messy and complicated and chaotic we can be. I think it's interesting. And so through that, I've learned to appreciate that, okay, so the sky is not perfectly blue, or this person isn't perfectly 100% how I want them to be, but that's fine. You appreciate them in spite of or maybe because of the flaws. There's numbing behavior. Numbing a lot of times looks like, it could be substances. It could be, dissociating on TikTok for hours on end. It could be video games. It can be exercise. If the thing that you're doing, the behavior you're doing over and over is meant to numb yourself and ignore what's going on, that's not healthy. So instead, you just set boundaries. You set boundaries for those behaviors, and you know where those boundaries are, and you don't go beyond them. And then actually letting it all hang out and being vulnerable can be a form of armor. So instead of just sharing stuff for no good reason, explain why. Explain why, what you intend to do, why you intend to share this, what you're looking to get out of it. And looking at things this way, all of these second phrases on there, they actually help me when things get messy. And I share that messiness. So why is it hard for us to be vulnerable? Why is it hard for us to be transparent? Well, we work in tech. We're logical minded. Our bosses sometimes think of us as coder robots. And so it's really scary when you're logically minded engineer and suddenly you have to talk about feelings. You have to talk about personal things. You have to talk about something beyond the code. But you can make it less scary and use it to your advantage, and you should. So stuff was falling apart in 2018. Stuff was kind of falling apart last year when I was laid off. Stuff falls apart all the time. And when it does, sometimes that means you got to watch out for yourself. Sometimes that means canceling plans. Sometimes that means deprioritizing things that had been really important to you. I used to love running long distances, and I just did not have time or capacity to deal with that, so that was something that kind of got set off to the side. It does more good than harm, especially if you can explain to those around you what is going on. Like, hey, I'm just not feeling well, I can't do X, or oh, don't have capacity to do Y. So that's one thing, and then the other is encouraging people to ask questions, which is an act of vulnerability as well, and learn. And then people find out that it's okay to ask for help, and they become more successful, and they feel more comfortable taking risks. So in the midst of failure, when my life was falling apart, I purposely started doing really scary to me things that made me feel challenged, that made me feel vulnerable. I'd been restricted from a lot of these things in the past, and admittedly, I was definitely very sad and just looking for any hit of dopamine I could get. But most of my biggest fears had already come true, but I was still alive. I was still there, and I still had my support system. So I figured everything else has got wrong. What do I have to lose? So the international keynote that I'd been accepted to, I'd expected to be going with my spouse and we were going to make a vacation of it. That didn't work out, so instead I went by myself. I went to Romania, and it was a country I knew nothing about. And I've been lucky to travel a fair bit. And the only other time I had traveled alone was when I was in college going to study abroad in Mexico. So I was alone pretty much while I was on the plane, and then when I landed, I was with the other students. So one of my bucket list items had always been to fly upstairs on a Boeing 747. Turned out when I booked my flight to Lithuania, it was on a 747. I cashed in all of my credit card points and flight credits to upgrade my seat to walk up the stairs. My ex would have never allowed that. He would have been like, blah, 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 it's a waste. But anyway, so I remember that moment where I was like, I'm walking on the plane, I'm sad, I'm scared, and I'm like, but this is something I've always wanted to do. And I walked up those stairs, and it was one of the most fantastic flights of my life. It was very calm, but it was very nice to do something for myself that I'd wanted to do. And so, and then when I was there, I went to the beach, I booked train tickets by myself, I did all sorts of adventuring, and I felt a lot more free. And now I love traveling by myself. I almost prefer it sometimes because then I can do what I want on my own terms. So allow yourself to be a human being. Understand that you have emotions, understand that they might not make sense, and understand that if there's something you want to do and it's something that you can make happen during a hard time, do it. And it doesn't have to be a big thing. It can be you're having a really hard time getting out, because this isn't, more realistic example. I would have hard times getting out of bed or hard times doing things, but there'd be maybe a new restaurant I wanted to try. So I would make myself get up and do something just to bring some life back and just to give me some piece of joy in a hard time. What else do I do when I'm in a failure, when I'm in a hard time, whether it's a layoff, whether it's something else? I practice gratitude. Now, gratitude is not toxic positivity. Toxic positivity is, it's the Black Knight in Monty Python, if you know that scene, where they keep cutting off his limbs and he's like, I'm not dead yet, I'm not dead yet. Toxic positivity is, you say you're not feeling well and somebody's like, oh, but that's okay, at least you're still alive. Like, yeah, but I'm miserable right now and I don't need your fake positivity at this moment. But what you can do in those moments is be thankful. And so I'm thankful that I have healthcare. I'm thankful that I can take the medicine I need to make myself feel better. And trying to remember those good little glimmers of hope help you on those really hard days. And also try to remind yourself of good things that came out of other situations where you failed. And think about how you've learned, think about how it's changed. As much as I hate when bad stuff happens, as hard as it is for me to get through, it happens. And I've kind of come to think of it sometimes as, hey, at least this gives me a good story, or it could be some talk material when things happen. So things that I do. You need to rely on a support system. This would not be a Cassandra Faris talk if I did not talk about the power of community. You need a community. That can be family, that can be friends. For me, I'm fortunate to have two amazing communities, one around my soccer football team and one around the tech community. And you need those people because you need people that you can reach out to when you're having a hard time. And you need people that you can talk to. On the flip side, the people who are toxic in your life, cut them out. I, about 3 years ago now, severed ties with a very long-term friend because she was just draining me. She was constantly negative. She was just, for a lot of reasons. And I actually feel so much better because now I no longer dread reading her text messages. I just know she's not going to talk to me. And cutting off those relationships, did that friendship fail? Yeah, maybe, but I'm better off for it. Rely on the good people in your life and then reciprocate. So if you're not going through a hard time, try to help others. Right now, I'm fortunate that things in life are going well, and so I have a little bit more capacity to help my friends who might be struggling with things. You need somebody to talk to, and if necessary, you might need a professional. Look for ways to gain new perspectives. For me, travel is a great way that I gain new perspectives. the break, everything. It's incredible. It can clarify a lot of things for you. If travel's not your thing, think about what it is that you like to do to put yourself in new environments or exposes you to new things and just gets you out of the house. Make a list of all of those things and pick one or two and do that stuff. And it can be as simple as, like I said, trying a new restaurant, watching a TV show you would never watch, reading a book outside of your normal types of books. Just find new ways to look at things, to introduce some novelty, which then again, like gives your brain some dopamine, but also it gives you something good and that you can be excited about. Distractions are good. Find goals, find a hobby, find a project, find something to keep yourself occupied. Think back early pandemic when everybody was baking sourdough bread and doing TikTok and picking up new hobbies. That's because we were going through an extremely hard time and we needed something to do, something to help us survive, and so we distracted ourselves. So in the midst of this, though, you keep your eyes on the prize and you know that sometimes there's going to be these hard days, so don't necessarily even pressure yourself to learn a new hobby or set a new goal. Like for me, I do better when I'm keeping busy, so I tend to, even in hard times, find new distractions and new ways to amuse myself. In some situations, this has meant things like signing up for a new fitness class, volunteering for a cause that I care about. I run a scholarship for women in tech. Stress baking used to be one of my favorite coping tools. I would just bake things to distract myself. I bought a swimming pool for my backyard. It was just this little 4-foot blow-up swimming pool, but I did that. And I got a puppy during the pandemic. Now, I had planned to get the puppy anyway, but I got a puppy. But also keeping myself occupied and keeping myself distracted can be playing video games and watching TikToks, maybe retail therapy, maybe indulging in vices, like whatever it is that are those distractions, just make sure that none of them takes over your life and none of them harms you. Big mistake I made. Don't make non-urgent decisions. When I was in the midst of everything, finding out I was no longer going to have a husband, I would have to find a new place to live, all the things, that was a very bad time to make a job switch. I should not have done that. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was making decisions for maybe some of the wrong motivations. And so that job wound up being my first professional failure. It was a mismatch between what the guy wanted me to do and what I was doing, and that's because I wasn't in a place where I was asking all of the right questions during the interview process. So don't make urgent decisions in the midst of a failure. You only have so much capacity, and when you're not working with the urgent things, you need to be resting and caring for yourself. Now, I can get up there and talk about all this, but setbacks happen, and they suck. So it's easier said than done to get through all of this stuff. And remember that, prepping for this talk got real meta when it came to setbacks. So as I was preparing for this talk, I got set back with the most on-brand injury ever, this full Pippin. I was kneeling down to greet the dog. He jumped up. The top of his skull hit me in the chin right here. This was 2 years ago now. My chin is still a little sore, and he gave me a concussion that still affects my cognitive abilities to this day. I got a concussion right before I was trying to write this talk and 2 other talks. So I had to step back and I had to be gentle on myself with that too, and just understand that I maybe wasn't going to get the talk done as quickly as I wanted to, and I was going to have to take some time to figure it out. And it happens. Failures happen repeatedly. And the failures will get you to where you are now. And so, yeah, I had a setback. I had a concussion. I had to miss a conference that I was supposed to fly out for the next day because of it. But it happens. I didn't get banned from conferences. I still get to come to them. It's fine. But your hard days are still going to be hard. And sometimes you just need a break. And that's okay too. Give in to the hard days. If you're having a really bad day, especially going through a really rough time, I know there's constant pressure to do the thing, whether it's constant pressure to be scheduling job interviews or doing paperwork or whatever it is, but some days you're just not feeling it. Some days you just need to lay in bed under the covers all day. Do that. That's okay. Don't do it all the time. Don't do it for too long, but do it. When it comes to work, take PTO if you need to. Take time off work to take care of yourself. And you don't have to necessarily tell your boss everything that's going on. You don't have to be like, hey, I'm having a bad mental health day and I can hardly get out of bed. You can simply call in and just tell them you're not feeling well and leave it at that. They don't need to know any more information than you're comfortable sharing. And you're not going to get help if you never ask. So ask for help. I always ask for help. I always give help to others. And you have to ask people, though, because people can't read your mind and people don't necessarily know how to support you. Like, you'll be going through a hard time and your friends will reach out to you and be like, I'm thinking about you. What can I do to help you? Blah, blah, blah. And our inclination is always to be like, I'm fine, I'm good, it's got this. But sometimes maybe instead say, well, I'd like to have, go sit down and have coffee with somebody. I'd like to do this or that thing that you can help me. Actually, one of my friends is going through a divorce right now that she did not want. And I told her that she's welcome to text me anytime and we can talk about what she's going through because there were a lot of similarities in our situation. So had she not asked for help, she wouldn't have that support. Sometimes we need professional help. Sometimes you can't handle loss and failure alone. I love my therapist. I've been seeing her for 5 years, and she gets me through a lot of the hard times, and she's given me a lot of tools to kind of stop making things feel so catastrophic every time something goes wrong. She helps me keep things in perspective. And then helping other people fail successfully. To borrow from Brené Brown, again, on a quote, she said, "The simple and honest process of letting people know that discomfort is normal and it's going to happen, why it happens, and why it matters reduces fear, anxiety, and shame." So acknowledge that failure is uncomfortable, whether it's your project going wrong and you need to go to your boss and be like, I don't know if this is going to be ready in time, or it's something else going on in your life. Acknowledge the awkwardness, acknowledge that these things are hard to talk about, and move on. And make it okay for people to say, I don't know. Now, the cool thing about failure is that it actually teaches you about boundaries as well. So reflect on and respect your boundaries, values, and goals. And this is the type of thing that winds up coming out a lot when I'm doing kind of retrospectives and things. I can look at an event or I can look at something that went wrong and say, oh, this is the thing that went wrong. I'm going to set a boundary around that, whether it's something I'm not going to do again, whether it's something I'm going to do differently. Basically, step back and reflect on your values, wants, and desires and create some boundaries. They also help you from sharing too many things. They help you from taking on too many things. I actually wish I'd had a better concept of boundaries when life was falling apart in 2018. Also having boundaries, it helps your reputation. And the cool thing about boundaries is that they're flexible. They can change and they should change. And that's why we need to be reflecting on these things regularly. And I'm not saying like every single day you need to sit down and do meditation or something. If that's your thing, do it, but reflect on things. And check in with yourself regularly. Check in to make sure that the things you're doing and saying are within your boundaries. And learn how to honor and state your boundaries, which gets hard at first, but the more you do it, it actually becomes fairly easy. Now, the hard thing about failure, or the hardest thing for me, is that when I'm in the midst of things falling apart, a lot of times we only see one path to success. Like, there was a point that I thought the only way I was going to succeed, the only way things were going to be good, was if I put my life back to exactly how it was prior to 2018. I didn't realize that maybe that was no longer the right life for me or where I was at that time. Maybe I'd grown beyond it, and I'm not thankful for everything I went through because that would be bullshit for me to say that. But I am glad I learned so much about myself in navigating, and I learned that success doesn't always look how we expect it to look. So when life was falling apart, I committed to a year of saying yes to nearly everything and every opportunity that came my way. This wound up being small things like doing karaoke at a conference was a very scary thing for me at one point, or going to like a local festival alone. And then big things like I committed to my current partner and actually decided to go to a conference in Antarctica as a person who hates the snow. As a person who was used to traveling with my partner, I decided to go to this conference in Antarctica with a woman who I hardly know, or I knew her professionally, but she wound up being my roommate. There were about 25 people at the conference. We were all speakers. And I committed to that partially because I was like, you know what, this is so completely off the rails from anything I would ever do. I'd been planning on taking myself on I was calling it my divorce vacation anyway, but I decided to shift that and do the Antarctica conference. And it was, as extreme as it sounds, it helped me so much, and I had a lot of fun. I have a lot of fun doing karaoke at conferences. I have a lot of fun doing bigger, more challenging things. So say yes to more things. Now, when you're ready to face new challenges, when you're ready to move forward, when you're ready to get through it all, you need repetition. So all the uncomfortable things that I did have actually helped me be willing to do even harder and more uncomfortable things, such as, they're not always fun things either, such as maybe talking to my doctor because I thought I needed a different ADHD medicine, or telling my manager that I was having this problem with the project. But doing those things so often has actually made it easier to talk about them. And again, knowing your boundaries, it's scary to set boundaries, it's scary to respect boundaries, but the more you do, the easier it gets. Now, being vulnerable is scary, especially in our industry, where it values logic, it values creativity. I'm a woman, and I sometimes worry that I'm going to be viewed as the emotional woman. It's scary. And sometimes the things that we feel the most vulnerable about are not logical, but they're still valid, and they're still something we can open up about. So every time I'm vulnerable, every time I take a risk, I risk the loss of people, opportunities, things from my life. And I have lost people over the years, but not nearly as many as I feared. And so many more amazing people have come into my life instead. And in retrospect, I came to understand, again, through reflecting on all the things that went wrong and doing my little self-retrospectives, I've come to realize that if a person or an opportunity isn't working out, then maybe they're not the right thing for me, and they have no place in my life, and that's okay. And I mean, loss sucks, failure sucks, but being stuck in a situation that makes us feel worse or doesn't feel our needs sucks even more. So definitely keep yourself. And when things seem overwhelming or when something is falling apart, the first thing I do, whatever is going wrong, whether it's layoff, whether it's, a project. More recently, I was running an event last week, and there was an issue with the caterers, and the caterers hadn't been paid, and there was this whole thing. And I had to sit and think about, okay, well, so the caterers haven't been paid. The event is tomorrow. How can I put this back together? How can I make sure that these people who are coming to my event will have lunch? And I thought about whether it could be put together. And if it couldn't have been put together, if things can't go back together, you have to work through the mourning, the loss, and the consequences. So I had to think about, well, if I can't get this paid out, then I'm going to have to explain to all these people that they don't have lunch, and they're going to be mad at me. And I thought through all of that. But the cool thing is that a lot of time things can be put back together. It can seem insurmountable, and you need to find a solution to it. And so what I wound up doing was talking to my manager and told him about the catering mess up. And he's like, all right, well, we can just put it on your credit card and expense it. And I'm like, that's fine with me. I want the credit card bonuses. But you have to figure out how to put things back together. And this is where job searches, especially, and layoffs are especially challenging, because it's this long process. It's a long time from lost job to new job. You're constantly interviewing, you're constantly working, you're constantly on, you're having the same conversation over and over. There's all this uncertainty, there's a lot of waiting around, and all of these steps that I was talking about earlier, those are all the things that I do to get through it. I mean, even now, not a day goes by that I don't fear a layoff, even with all evidence to the contrary. But the thing is, I can't let that fear or that anxiety stop me from moving forward. I can't let it stop me from living my life. So I just try to remind myself that it's my anxiety brain lying to me, and that I actually am safe, and that I'm doing the best that I can every day. So when I first learned about Agile, Scrum, embracing failure, like I said, my mind was blown. But eventually it helped me understand that failure is inevitable in every aspect of our life, that it's okay, and that you can learn to embrace it. So did anybody play Animal Crossing during the pandemic? All right, cool. So failure can force you to step back and reflect on what really matters and what you really want in life. And I remember thinking I wanted my own life back. But the more I think back on it, the more I realize that I don't. You know, my happiness and my success look different now than I thought they should have looked. And that's something that I also learned through constantly reflecting on what's going on in life. So I'm grateful for those lessons learned. And for me, this was actually one of my coping tools. I played Animal Crossing because it was calm, it was relaxing, it was pretty, like there was no pressure, there's no stress, you can do whatever you want. And in this game, there's this little dude, Cap'n, this little turtle guy, and he takes you on a little boat ride. And when he goes on his little boat ride, he sings you a different sea shanty, and it's random. There's about 20 different sea shanties. But one day I was having, I think it was pandemic Christmas is right around the time this happened. But I was sad because I wasn't with my family. I was, missing a lot of things, all this. And this little quote came up from Animal Crossing, of all places, from a video game. And he said, "Don't cry about dreams that don't come true today. Sometimes you need to try another way." And that hit me, because that means that your life isn't necessarily going to go back to how it was, but that can be okay. So get out there, take care of yourselves, take some time to sit back and reflect, and let's stay in touch. I'm happy to take questions.